My radio crackled to life. A voice, mixed with static, came through the speaker. Urgent assistance required at the park on Grande Avenue. An unidentified woman has been attacked and is in critical condition. Grande Avenue is just a few blocks away. I turned on the ignition and pressed the button next to the radio. Understood. On my way. Any information about the nature of the attack? Nothing further. The voice replied, accompanied by static. I backed the car out onto the road and quickly headed toward Grande Avenue. From a distance, I could already hear sirens. Ambulances from other rescue units were rushing to the scene. Something serious was definitely happening. After a few minutes, I arrived at the scene. I quickly flashed my badge and crossed the police tape. I walked past ambulances and rescue vehicles to an area where a group of uniformed personnel stood huddled around a spot. A police officer glanced back and seemed to recognize me, perhaps from training, then stepped aside to give me a clear view of what had caused the commotion. I clicked my tongue. Before me lay a woman on the ground. The only way to identify her as a woman was that I had been told so. The woman before me was so disfigured that her original appearance was unrecognizable. Her entire body was pierced by thousands of toothpicks, each embedded deep into her flesh. Blood trickled from every wound, coating her body in red that pooled on the ground nearby, and she was still alive. She was visibly and painfully taking heavy breaths. A nearby paramedic informed me that she wouldn't last much longer. "We can't move her. Any movement forces the toothpicks deeper into her skin, making things worse, and we can't remove them," he said, his voice heavy with sadness. "Why not?" I asked. He looked up at me, and for the first time I saw fear in his eyes. "That's the problem. We can't. The toothpicks all have barbs at the ends, meaning they can only go deeper, and we don't want that to happen. We tried to insert a breathing tube, but couldn't." He gestured toward the woman. "There are toothpicks in her nose, too." I stared at the woman for a long moment. I watched her chest rise as she struggled to breathe, then fall, forcing the toothpicks deeper and accelerating the already horrifying blood loss. I looked at the medics, who were beginning to realize that this woman was going to suffer a slow and agonizing death, and none of them could do anything to stop it. I had seen many things in my career, but this was beyond anything I had encountered before. I prided myself on staying composed in any situation. I could maintain a calm demeanor and handle anything thrown my way. But this was different. The sheer brutality of the attack felt like a whirlpool of emotions threatening to spill out of me if I wasn't careful. Everything about this scene felt wrong. The human body wasn't meant to be treated this way. An instinct deep inside urged me to flee. A primal fear rooted in my brain. But I couldn't. Despite the terror of the unknown, I had a job to do. I turned back to the paramedic. "How was she found?" He sighed, mirroring the grim state of the situation. "A passerby called emergency services. We've tried everything we can to help her, but..." He trailed off, his gaze seeming to drift somewhere far away. "Is there anything else I should know?" I asked. He looked at me, though not directly. His eyes seemed glazed and distant, as though staring into the void, not truly registering where he was. I assumed it was shock. "Well, there were a few items found near her," he finally said. He stepped away to retrieve them, then returned with a small folded piece of paper and a tiny silver wristwatch, which he handed to me. The watch caught my attention. It looked familiar. Then again, perhaps all small silver chain-link watches looked the same, but there was something different about this one. The weight and feel of the metal against my palm seemed to awaken a long-forgotten memory buried deep in my mind. I could almost feel that I had held this watch years ago and strapped it onto a wrist, mine or someone else's. I turned the watch over. 2 simple letters were engraved on the back, 2 letters that drained the color from my face and made the world seem to collapse around me. The same 2 letters I had engraved there 6 years ago. Alice Edris, my sister. She had been presumed missing for over 3 years, disappearing after going out for a late-night run and never returning, leaving behind a grieving husband and a 4-year-old daughter. The search had eventually been abandoned, with no clues and no witnesses. How do you begin to search for someone who has vanished entirely? With my mind racing with questions, I turned back to her. I forced myself to look past the blood, the toothpicks, and the ruined flesh. I looked into her eyes, the only part of her body not riddled with toothpicks, and I broke down. Because at that moment, I knew. Her eyes were bloodshot and hollow, but I had seen enough. The woman lying on the ground before me was my sister. I thought she had died, and now I was witnessing her death all over again, unable to even recognize her until now. I turned away from her and from everyone around me. The events were too overwhelming to process, and I knew I had to leave the scene before I broke down completely. The grief was too immense, the tears too strong. I nodded to the officer manning the police tape and crossed it again. As I left, I realized I was still holding the small piece of paper the paramedic had handed me, also found near the body. I unfolded it. What do you think of my little porcupine? If you like it, don't worry. My zoo is just getting started. When you've done this job long enough, you're bound to witness horrifying things. Believe me, I've seen it all. A cheating husband driving his wife into a murderous rage that ended in a murder-suicide. A young girl shoved in front of an oncoming train by an obsessive stalker. And now, my sister dying in agony, her body pierced by thousands of toothpicks, reduced to what the killer called a porcupine. Yes, as you can guess, that last one is the case I'm working on now, trying to figure out how the perpetrator got away with it. None of it makes sense. For one, the toothpicks must have been inserted somewhere else before she was transported to the park and left to die. There were no witnesses. And then there's the matter of the toothpicks themselves. The medics at the scene said she couldn't be moved without forcing the toothpicks deeper, worsening the blood loss. So, how did the killer do it? I have an answer to that question, though I don't want to think about it. The toothpicks were probably inserted one at a time over the course of months, maybe even years, allowing each wound to heal before moving on to the next. And here's the final question that keeps me up at night. Why? What does the killer gain from spending months just to embed toothpicks into my sister's body? Why my sister? I have no answers. Perhaps it was an act of revenge, or maybe it was just a random murder. This only deepens the wound in my heart. I'm still reeling from the shock of learning she had been alive all these years, and seeing her treated this way feels like salt poured into that wound. I'm grieving, yes, but the killer's note made it clear that my sister was just the beginning. Solving this case is now my top priority. I can't let this happen again. Only when the killer is caught will I truly be able to mourn. So I sit in my office, wearing my sister's watch on my wrist, poring over the facts. The day after the murder, I received a birthday card with an address written inside, sent directly to me. Forensic analysis confirmed that the handwriting matched the note at the scene. Receiving a handwritten birthday card is unusual, but it raises even more questions. How did the killer know I'd be assigned to this case? Were they at the scene that night? Did they know it was my sister and are now targeting me? As always, nothing is clear. But an address is still an address, and in my line of work, such leads must be taken seriously. I pick up the birthday card again, staring at the cartoon giraffe wishing me a funny day. Yes, birthday card jokes are strange. I look back at the address. 12 Biker Street, as if it holds some hidden meaning I haven't yet uncovered. But there was still nothing. It seemed like it was just an address. So I coordinated with my boss to lead the team down to Baker Street that night to see if we could find anything. I secretly hoped we wouldn't find anything, that this was just a wild goose chase. I was afraid of what I might find there if it were otherwise. That night, I arrived at 12 Baker Street with the 3 best men I knew. Thompson, a burly man who could stay calm in any situation. Grammars, not as physically impressive as Thompson, but his intelligence more than made up for it. His quick thinking had saved many officers, and Edison, an analyst who always caught every detail, whether in the field or in the office. I had chosen the best to face the worst. Baker Street was a row of warehouses in an industrial zone on the outskirts of the city. All the warehouses looked the same, large, rectangular, and built with red bricks. Nearly half of them were still operational, producing various materials for shipping worldwide, while the other half appeared abandoned. Number 12 Baker Street was one of the latter. It had an unremarkable appearance: broken windows, piles of trash scattered outside, crumbling bricks in places, and a door slightly off its hinges. But this was the place. I gritted my teeth and signaled to the others before slowly stepping through the open front door. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust to the darkness inside because I had refused to use a flashlight at the time. I could hear the unmistakable sound of water dripping from the ceiling into something hollow nearby. The air felt thick and musty, mostly smelling of damp cardboard and something faintly metallic. Blood. The sharp, pungent scent overwhelmed all others. I pressed forward, my team following closely behind. Edison looked at me with a raised eyebrow, and I nodded in response. "This is the place," I silently told him. "Be ready for anything." We passed through another set of doors and into a room dimly lit by a bulb hanging from the ceiling. And in the center of the room, under the light, was a person, or calling it a person might be a stretch. Normally, a human neck is about 10 to 15 centimeters long, measured from the shoulders to the chin. The figure before me had a neck 10 times that length. He was kneeling, his neck sprouting from his shoulders like a vine and bending downwards. The neck continued to snake along the floor for about 1.5 meters before ending in a head. He saw us and began to crawl slowly towards us, dragging both his head and that grotesquely long neck. He groaned in pain as he moved, and I could see streams of blood trickling from stitches spaced every few centimeters along his neck. As he got closer, blood dripped onto the floor, leaving a bright red trail behind him with every step. He groaned again, looking up at us, clearly in excruciating pain. "What the hell is this?" Grammaires exclaimed behind me. I continued staring at the figure. I didn't know either. An animal-themed mutated creature, it seemed. I stood still, observing, unsure of what to do, as he dragged his elongated neck and body towards us. He looked directly into my eyes, his mouth opening as if to speak, but only eerie groans came out. Still, I understood what he was trying to say, his mouth forming a circular shape, seemingly emphasizing a single syllable. "Help!" I stepped back, mostly out of fear. I knew this creature probably wouldn't harm me, but deep in my mind, alarm bells were ringing. This wasn't natural. Humans weren't supposed to look like this. I needed to leave, right now. I could feel my team behind me also starting to tense up and back away, perhaps experiencing the same thoughts I was. The man continued crawling forward, extending the trail of blood behind him. Each movement became slower and weaker. Life seemed to be draining from him. Clearly, I was witnessing the final moments of someone tortured to death. Then, a voice echoed, the sound coming from above, fragmented and distorted, likely from a speaker system. It sounded calm and even cheerful, as if everything happening was perfectly normal. "Welcome all guests to the zoo's latest attraction, humans. A beautiful giraffe crafted by slowly tearing apart pieces of his neck and replacing them with larger, more fitting human parts." I grimaced. It didn't sound pleasant. A slow process, yes, but look at the final result. Isn't it magnificent? Clearly much better than its original form, right, Jonathan? I looked up, almost reflexively. That was my name. Anyway, I just wanted to extend my heartfelt thanks to you for volunteering such a fine specimen to add to my collection. I know you'll absolutely love the amazing things I've prepared for you. The voice stopped, and at that moment, I became aware of two things: the metallic sound of something clashing to my right, on the far side of the room, and a gunshot. To my left, Thompson's leg jerked violently backward, causing him to collapse to the ground, blood gushing from an area just above his knee. A gunshot wound. I did what anyone facing an invisible gunman in the room would do: ducked and darted for cover. Fear was the primary driver, and I was terrified beyond measure. I found a pile of boxes to hide behind, shielding myself from the sniper's line of sight. I stayed still, chest heaving with adrenaline and fear, assessing the situation. Thompson lay motionless on the floor, perhaps hitting his head when he fell. Edison was right beside me, also hiding behind the boxes. Grammaires was nowhere to be seen, and there was a shooter at large. Nothing was okay. Then, the overhead light flickered off, and nothing makes your heart race faster than being plunged into sudden darkness. I heard footsteps nearby, close to where Thompson was lying. It could have been Grammaires trying to help him, or the gunman trying to finish the job. I hoped it was Grammaires. Heavier footsteps followed, louder. There were more people. I considered rushing to Thompson, grabbing him and leaving, but he was too heavy. I turned to Edison to see if he had a plan, but he was also blacking out. I looked around. The poor giraffe lay motionless on the floor, dead or dying. Grammaires was squirming on a crate in the distance, nearly dead. Thompson was gone. The sniper was gone. Edison helped me get Grammaires back to the car. He was bruised, looking like he'd been in a fight, but he was still breathing for the most part. I couldn't say the same about the giraffe. We ran a sweep of the warehouse, but found nothing. The place seemed to have been cleaned before, or maybe never used at all. It was hard to make sense of it all. I'd lost Thompson, and in his place was a man with a neck nearly 20 feet long. Thompson was out there, in some demonic form I didn't dare think of. Grammaires lay in the hospital, badly beaten. Edison was in a state of shock, understandably so. I was scared. Everyone was scared. But what haunted me most were the words over the PA system. They said the giraffe's neck was made of larger pieces of flesh, as if he had more people to use, and judging by the length of his neck, more than one, a lot. There were others out there, lots of them. I should start by saying that I was no longer a detective. After the incident at the warehouse, I was called in to see my immediate superior, Sergeant Lang Lee. When I walked in, she was sitting behind a wooden desk, staring intently at some file. She looked up and said, "What the hell happened, Jonathan?" "We were unprepared, sir," I replied. She squinted at me across the table. "We have one missing and one seriously injured." "How unprepared is that? You had no precautions?" "With all due respect, sir, you weren't there," I replied, my voice a little irritated. "Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw there." "Do you think anyone could have kept their cool about that?" She sighed, looking down at the file, her eyes scanning the lines. "The boss wants me to give you a break." "Seriously, sir?" I started. She raised her hand to stop me. "Listen, the media is all over this. For everyone's sake, including yours," she pointed at me, "it's best if you take a break from this." I stared at her. She stared back, raising an eyebrow. After a moment, I reluctantly showed her my badge and gun. Lang Lee smiled again. "It's okay. It'll all pass. Take a break, okay?" I didn't answer. I left her office. It was 12 noon, and I had nothing to do but worry about what had happened. So I went home and slept. After everything that had happened in the past few days, I was really exhausted. I woke up to the sound of the doorbell ringing. I was still half asleep, pulling the pillow over my head, hoping whoever was knocking would go away. The bell rang again. I rolled over in bed, looking at the clock. 4 p.m. I was more tired than I thought. The bell rang again. I slowly sat up, walking to the door, still not fully awake. When I opened the door, a scruffy, skinny young man of about 18 stood there smiling politely at me. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice a little rude. Yeah. I was hired to drive you somewhere. I mean, if you want to go, he said. I looked at him, trying to gauge if he was telling the truth. So what? He shrugged. I'm not sure. Someone gave me $500 to ask if you wanted to come with me, but you didn't have to. They told me to say it was your decision. A flash of memory crossed his face. Oh, right. I have to give you this. He handed me a folded piece of paper. I unfolded it and read the scribbled words inside. I heard you quit your job. You should come work at my zoo. We always need more keepers. The young man looked at me over the paper. So what? Are you going? I looked at him blankly. What could I say? How could anyone know I lost my job? This had only just happened. This was clearly a trap. This kid could be an accomplice. The last time I followed a piece of paper like that, I lost one person and almost lost another. Should I stay or go? I turned to look at the boy. Okay, I'll go. The boy drove with the care of a new driver. We drove a long way, slowly taking me out of the city into the deserted countryside. After about 30 minutes of driving along deserted roads, the land around became quieter and more desolate. Finally, he stopped at the entrance to a large farm. I glanced at the sign as we drove in. Winston Family Farm. The road split and he took the right road, eventually leading to a country house. The lights inside were on, and I could hear the sound of machinery from the large barn behind. The boy stopped. This is your stop. Have a wonderful evening, sir, he said cheerfully, giving me enough time to get out of the car before he turned and drove away from the farm. I watched until the lights disappeared over the horizon, then walked up the steps and into the hallway. I heard voices from inside the house, talking, laughter, like any house at dinner time. Unsure of what to do, I knocked. The voices stopped. I heard light footsteps on the wooden floor, approaching the door. The door opened. A man appeared, medium height, short hair, a scraggly beard. He looked at me with a distant gaze, then smiled, gesturing for me to come in. I'm glad you came. Dinner's ready. Come in and eat with us. His voice was deep and familiar. So familiar. I knew him. I know you, I said accusingly. Memories flashed back to the night I found my sister's body, the paramedic who'd given me the paper that started it all, the man who'd always seemed to be looking into the distance. No, not just looking, but searching. He tilted his head slightly. Oh, I'm glad to hear that. That makes it easier to make friends. Come on, you look hungry. Let's eat. I didn't move. I'm not eating with you, I shouted at him. You killed my sister. He looked at me quizzically. No, I didn't. I was just a caretaker. You've got it all wrong. I don't care what you say. I waved him off. Hey man, let's calm down and talk about this over dinner. I'm serious. Come on in. And he turned and walked down the hall, turning left into a room that I assumed was the dining room. I heard a few whispers and the sound of chairs scraping. It seemed like everyone had left. I had two choices. I could go in and figure out what was happening, or I could walk away and forget everything. There was one problem, though. I would never forget the pain. It would never go away. The horrific things I had seen could not be erased from my memory. I stepped forward, into the room where the medic had entered earlier. Inside was a table set, as if for a large family meal. In the center of the table was a roasted lamb, with several slices already carved out. Surrounding it were side dishes and beverages. A man sat at the head of the table, directly opposite me. It seemed everyone else had left. The man spoke, his voice deep, warm, and commanding. It's wonderful that we can finally meet, Jonathan. I have so much I want to tell you. And who are you? I asked. He chuckled softly. You'll find out soon enough, he said, gesturing toward me. Come, have a seat. Eat whatever you'd like. I recommend trying the steamed asparagus. It's excellent. I stayed where I was. He didn't seem to mind and continued speaking. Now I want to remind you that you came here voluntarily. and you can leave anytime you want. We're not forcing you to stay, but I would truly like to have your presence." He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. "Now, before I ramble any further, do you have any questions? What's troubling you the most?" I didn't need much time to think of a question. Why are you doing this? Why did you kill all these people? He paused for a moment, looking surprised. Jumping straight to the point, are we?" He sighed. "Look around the world. What do you see?" "All I see is death," I replied. "You, of all people, should know that. People die constantly, hundreds every second, thousands every minute. So what does it matter if I take a few more lives? It's just a drop in the ocean of death." He stood up. "And when people die, everything becomes meaningless. All that they've done becomes worthless in the endless void of eternity. But it's more than that. As a species, we are edging closer and closer to death. We never make the right choices. So, on behalf of everyone, I am making the choices." I shook my head in disbelief. "What choices? You're just torturing people to death. How could that solve anything?" "Do you still not understand?" His voice rose. "I am saving us all. I am leading humanity's evolution. Soon, I will be worshipped across the world as the only one who saw the truth and had the courage to act." He turned back to me, his eyes alight with conviction. "The first deaths were unfortunate, yes, but they've contributed to my ideals in ways you cannot imagine. I have nearly created the perfect being, the savior of humanity." He pointed his finger directly at me. "And you will join me, becoming a keeper and an inheritor of this new world." I stayed silent for a moment. This man was insane. Join him? Who did he think he was? I would leave the moment I had the chance, but I had one more question for him. Why me out of everyone? Why choose me? He smiled, then let out a low chuckle. "So clever, yet you don't understand? I didn't choose you. Look at you trembling in a corner. There are so many others out there who are more fitting than you," he said, with a hint of disdain. "Now tell me, why do you think I chose you?" I don't know. The papers. My sister. You seemed interested in me," I stammered. He scoffed. "Do you really not know? Tell me, does your sister often take walks at midnight?" The question stunned me. I had always focused on how my sister disappeared, not why she had been there. The only way she could have vanished was if she allowed it to happen. But I had dismissed that thought right away. She wouldn't let herself be taken, would she? Would she? The man raised an eyebrow at my silence. "You deserve to know the truth. Everyone does. Some people like to hide secrets in the dark, hoping they'll never come to light, but not me. I strive for transparency in everything I do. I yearn for a world with no more lies, because there will be nothing left to lie about. Everyone will be accepted. Everyone will be valued. If you need proof, didn't I tell you exactly where this place was twice already? That's fairness for you." "The first time, you shot at us," I said. "I didn't shoot at you. You just happened to be there," he replied. "Listen, I'll explain everything, but first, I need something from you." He raised a glass and took a sip. "Your loyalty. Tell me, Jonathan, will you join me?" "Are you insane to think I'd want to be part of this?" I replied firmly. A slow smile spread across his face. Pity. His eyes scanned my body, as if seeing through everything. "Look at you, always slithering into situations you shouldn't be involved in. I think you'd make a fitting snake." I heard a sound behind me. I turned just in time to see a metal bar swinging toward me, striking my forehead with a loud crack, sending me crashing to the floor. The pain was excruciating. That was the first thing I registered upon waking. A burning sensation, searing through my body, concentrated on my forehead. It was agony. A sharp, throbbing pain, synchronized with my racing heartbeat, blurring my vision and ringing my ears. The pain was unbearable. The cold metal floor pressed into my sweat-soaked back. My hands were secured by some kind of restraint, severely limiting my movement. I was trapped with a murderer. Panic seized me. I struggled to wrench my hands free, clinging to the desperate hope of escape. The pain in my arms intensified, promising nasty bruises. I screamed in agony, only to discover a gag stuffed in my mouth. Struggling only made it worse. "You know," a voice rasped from behind me. It was the man from dinner. "As I said, you're free to leave any time, but if you don't pledge your loyalty, I'll have to employ other methods." He stepped into my line of sight, a saw in his hand. "I'll be quick, but fair warning, I don't like using anesthetics. The body needs to know pain. It's natural." He circled to my other side, activating a camera on a tripod facing me. The blinking light indicated it was recording. He returned, placing the saw's blade against my left arm, just above the elbow. "Now, a snake doesn't have hands, so I'll start there." I fought against the restraints again. Fear pumped adrenaline into my veins. There was no escape. Panic surged, and the basic human survival instinct, self-preservation, kicked in. I was doing everything I could to get out of this situation. "Don't struggle, Jonathan. It only makes it take longer. It'll be over quickly, I promise," he said, his voice calm and collected. And with that, he pushed the saw down. My body screamed in pain, and my vision went black. I felt the blood flowing from the incision. The man continued pushing the saw down, sawing back and forth, severing veins and arteries. I felt him hit bone, and then he kept sawing. I felt the sickening crunch of my arm bone as it was severed. I passed out for the second time that night. When I awoke, the gag was gone, and so was my arm. The remaining stump was tightly wrapped in bandages and a tourniquet. Everything hurt, but far worse than before. The man was still there behind the camera, seemingly pleased to see me awake. "Sleep well?" He approached, taking my remaining hand. "Everyone deserves a choice. Free will defines us. So, I'll give you a choice. You can get up and leave right now and work for me, or you'll lose your other arm and have your legs sewn together. It's entirely up to you. Work for a madman, or die at the hands of a madman." The survival instinct was stronger than honor. I want to work for you," I managed to croak out. "Very good. Let me uncuff you then." He produced a key from his pocket and quickly unlocked the restraints. I tried to sit up, then collapsed as my head swam. The man began to walk away. "Now, I'll begin your training. You're free to leave or explore the house whenever you wish. If you're hungry, there are leftovers in the fridge. As I said, we don't keep you here." He turned back and smiled. "You'll enjoy this, Jonathan. Goodbye." He left the room, ascending a flight of stairs I hadn't noticed before. It took me a while to stand, waiting until the ground stopped spinning beneath me. Walking was strange with one arm, light and unbalanced. I looked around. This seemed to be a basement beneath the house, with various surgical implements scattered about, along with recording equipment placed throughout. Some were still operating, but most were switched off. There was a door to my left, and the stairs directly in front. A sign with a single word was attached to the door: "Elephant." I opened the door. Inside, a dim light, heavy with the cloying stench of musk and waste. A small machine in the corner hummed, connected to a large mass in the middle of the room. The door slammed shut behind me. The mass stirred. I recoiled in fear. My vision sharpened, revealing a horrifying realization. It was a human being, enormous, their body encased in layers upon layers of fat. This behemoth slowly turned to face me. Tubes from the machine connected to a mask over its mouth. The tubes continuously pumped a pale gray liquid into its mouth. I had only seen this once before, while tracking a killer in an abandoned asylum. It was a forced feeding device. 2 large metal bars protruded from either side of the mask, inserted into its nostrils, piercing out near the temples. Judging by the scarring around them, those bars had been drilled into its skull until they emerged on the other side. I shuddered at the thought. The human slowly dragged itself across the floor. It looked up at me, its eyes pleading for release. I saw something else. A flicker of recognition, an understanding. I looked closer, past everything I didn't want to see, past everything I didn't want to think about, and I recognized a friend. I saw Thompson. He was battered, ravaged, and larger than before, but it was still him. I rested my head on his shoulder and cried, long and hard. This, more than anything, broke me. Thompson didn't deserve this. No one deserved this. I looked back, towards the saw that had severed my arm. I stood up and picked it up with my remaining hand. I brought it to Thompson's face. His eyes were wet, but he nodded, a slow, deliberate nod. He clearly understood what it meant. It would be difficult to saw with one hand, so I opted for a swift, forceful thrust to finish the job. A clean cut, severing his aorta, ending his agonizing existence. I dropped the saw beside Thompson. I walked up the stairs and out the front door. I didn't notice the hard, gravelly path underfoot, but I kept walking. I would leave, and nothing could stop me. He'd said so, and I was leaving. But not forever. I would be back. For Thompson, for Alice. I had nothing left to lose and everything to regain. 3 things occupied my mind as I walked home. First, how to find a vehicle to get back. By my estimate, I was at least a 30-minute drive from any trace of civilization. There was a possibility a car would pass, but the odds of them going my way were slimmer still. I thought I could return to the farmhouse and try to hotwire a car, but I didn't want to go back there. At least, not yet. Second, my lack of shoes. Sharp stones cut into my feet, drawing blood with every painful step. Eventually, I had to walk on the muddy verge, less painful but prompting the question, of everything that man could have taken from me, why the shoes? The answer was obvious enough, a psychological game. He'd hired someone to drop me off in the wilderness with no feasible way to return. He knew the first thing I'd want to do was leave, so he took the shoes to create 2 choices, return and confront him, or continue walking in pain, even if only minor pain. A psychological game. Finally, I had made a mistake, a serious mistake. I had continuously been manipulated by that man. He was always 2 steps ahead of me, and looking back, it had been foolish to confront him. I had, I suppose, had delusions of bravery and revenge, but all I achieved was losing an arm and losing a friend. I could admit I shouldn't have done it, but I could also change. Just one call to the police, and I could end this nightmare. I had the address, the confession, the evidence, and I'd decided I wasn't going to face this alone anymore. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. No signal. Great. I continued walking for another 20 minutes or so before I heard the rumble of an engine behind me. I turned. A truck was appearing on the horizon, heading in my direction. Fantastic. It was an old blue pickup, rattling and rumbling across the gravel, kicking up a cloud of dust. I stuck out my thumb. In that moment, I probably didn't look like anyone's ideal hitchhiker, shoeless and one-armed, but it was worth a try. I hoped it was a kind farmer on his way to town for supplies. The truck drew closer. The driver assessed me from head to toe, then pulled over to the side of the road. I opened the door and climbed into the passenger seat. "Thank you," I said to the driver. He turned to look at me, or rather, through me. Short, cropped hair, a scruffy beard, and those distant eyes, as if he couldn't stop, or was always searching for something. It was the nurse again. I opened the door, stepping out. "I'm not doing this again. I'd rather walk home." The nurse took a few steps, blocking my path, forcing me to go around the truck to continue. I stopped. He climbed out of the truck. "Hey, Jonathan," he said, waving. I didn't respond. He came towards me, extending his hand. I didn't take it, holding my hand suspended in the air for quite some time before lowering it. Look, maybe we started this the wrong way. I'm Michael. Nice to see you again. The pleasure's all yours, I said, my voice dripping with contempt. He gazed distantly, his eyes unfocused. So, you called 911? I couldn't let you do that, he said. How did you know? I challenged him. He shrugged. The GPS tracker in your arm, it lets us know your location and interferes with phone signals. I fitted it when you were unconscious. So, it wasn't a signal problem. He shifted, leaning back against his truck. So, to put it bluntly, come back with us. Clearly you can't be trusted to stay away. The police? We'll do this fairly. We're not here to hurt you. You said you'd work for us. Come back, Jonathan. And how will you stop me? I asked, bracing myself for a fight. The man shook his head, looking disappointed. He pulled his keys from his pocket and pressed a button on a key ring. I collapsed in pain, a powerful vibration spreading through my body, increasing in intensity. Michael released the button. I forgot to mention the tracker has a failsafe. You just experienced level 3. Believe me, you wouldn't want to try level 8. He touched his eye. It disrupts everything inside your body, and level 10 kills you instantly. My reflexive gaze shot to my right arm. Inside there, somewhere, was a tiny, deadly machine. Well, Jonathan, do you want to come back? I didn't have many choices. The ride back was silent. Every time Michael tried to start a conversation, I only responded with curt answers. I wanted to make it clear that I didn't want to be here. The man drove us along a narrow path to the farm. The old ringleader sat on the porch, waiting for me. He knew I'd come back. He said I had a choice, but there never really was one. The illusion of choice. A psychological game. The old man stood up, greeting me as I stepped out of the car. Jonathan, you're back. I'm so glad to see you again. He waved me inside. Come on in. I have a lot to share with you. The others were eating breakfast. I followed him into the dining room where I'd first met him. Around the table, about 19 people were eating breakfast. Bacon, eggs, and other morning dishes. I recognized most of them. Sergeant Lang Lee was spreading butter on a piece of bread. She smiled and waved at me. Edison sat next to her, pouring milk into a glass. He turned away, avoiding eye contact with me, probably ashamed to be here. There were others I'd seen in the field before. Nurses, police officers, politicians, journalists, doctors, and surgeons. All sharing a meal together in the house of a murderer. The man clapped his hands from behind me. All right, everyone, let's welcome Jonathan. He's our newest recruit, but we're expecting many more to come. Welcome, Jonathan. A chorus of voices greeted me. I looked around the room, my throat dry and tight, overwhelmed. He turned and gestured for me to follow. He continued guiding me through the house, pointing out each room and explaining the layout. A kitchen, 2 living rooms, 3 bathrooms spread across 2 floors, and several bedrooms, though it seemed everyone slept in tents outside. Then, he led me down to the basement. This is where the magic happens, he said, winking. Everything was just as I'd left it. A large operating table, stained with dried blood, sat in the middle of the room. It was surrounded by various machines and tools. There was a stark contrast between the sterile equipment on one side and the rusty saw hanging on a nail on the other. And in the center of it all were cameras, mounted on tripods around the room. I took a closer look. What are the cameras for? I asked. The old man chuckled. What do you think? I make money to fund all of this, he said. How? I turned to face him, the pieces slowly falling into place in my mind. He sold videos of people being tortured. The old man grinned. You've got it. Torture films are wildly popular in certain corners of the internet. Of course, that's not my primary motivation, but it supports my goals. The video of your hand being sawed off, for example, sold for nearly $5,000. I get paid to saw off a few limbs, and then I get more money to cut up more parts. An endless cycle. It's perfect. You've seen the results of this system yourself. The old man nodded toward the door labeled elephant. He continued, "That's where I keep my unfinished pieces. Of course, it's empty now. Such a shame. He turned out to be the finest elephant I've ever made. But don't worry, we'll soon have a cat." I shuddered as he spoke about Thompson, as if what happened to him was just a normal, everyday occurrence. It made me sick. How could anyone do this daily and still think of themselves as a good person? Something else kept lingering in my mind. "You once said that the night my sister was taken, she did something I didn't know about. What was it?" The man paused for a moment. "How close were you to your sister?" I shrugged. "Fairly close. We talked once a month and visited each other every Christmas. Do you know what she was working on? Some kind of advanced anesthetic, but she didn't succeed." "She did," the man said plainly, waiting for me to process before continuing. "I met Alice on an online forum. From the start, she fascinated me. She talked about the decay of the world and plans for rebirth, for restoring humanity. She had many ideas, Jonathan. Everything you see here stems from her research. We met in person and clicked instantly. She was perfect, brilliant, and she was mine." "Then why did you kill her?" I asked. I saw his eyes blur, as if he might cry. "The anesthetic didn't work as intended. Instead of numbing pain, it heightened it. The mechanism was beyond comprehension, devastating. Just a small dose caused unimaginable agony, as if every atom in the body were being burned alive. Death would have been mercy. But there was a side effect. Death became impossible once the drug took effect. She had to endure it. So all the people I've seen," I let the question hang. "It's easy to manipulate someone's body when they have no strength to resist, no ability to die. Alice wanted to be the first. I begged her not to, told her there were more suitable candidates, but she insisted. We staged the abduction. No evidence because there was no struggle, no fight, nothing. She came to this farm willingly and became the first on that table. I spent years driving toothpicks into her skin while she was under the anesthetic. She endured it, and she kept sharing ideas I never would have thought of." He stopped, his body trembling with labored breaths. "She told me to find people in power, if they didn't join willingly, to force them. She said they would eventually see we were working for humanity's greater good. And the last thing she told me before I laid her back down in the park was, 'Find my brother, hire him, change his perspective.' And now you're here." I froze in silence, unsure of what to say. Everything I thought I knew about my sister shattered. Maybe the old man was lying. My sister couldn't possibly have been this fanatical, this deranged, this eager to inflict suffering. That wasn't her. And yet, it all made sense. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't find a way to refute it. The old man was right, and I knew it. The man turned back to me. "Come, Jonathan. There's one more thing you need to see." He led me out of the basement, through the back door. We walked past a large vegetable garden and rows of cramped tents, most of them empty. It seemed like they were preparing for many more people. I followed him past a fire pit, where logs were arranged in a circle, toward a large barn at the back of the farm. The barn was painted classic red, with a steep roof and wide white doors. Inside, there was a cacophony of noises, groans and scratching sounds, as though from a massive machine or a large number of people. "This," the old man pointed at the barn. "This is my masterpiece, my life's work. This is the beginning of the vision Alice wanted for this world. This is where your initiation will take place, where you'll become a true keeper. You'll learn to deliver justice and guide humanity into the new world." He strode ahead and opened the wide doors so I could get a glimpse inside. It was dark and stifling. "Welcome, Jonathan," he announced grandly, "to the human zoo." I stepped inside. A stench hit me like a tidal wave. The foul reek of blood and rotting flesh filled the air. It made me gag. My head spun as I tried to catch a breath of fresh air. In vain. My stomach churned and rose to my throat. I turned to the side and vomited onto the floor, staring at the mess beneath me. I wasn't the first. Rows upon rows of cages lined the barn, packed tightly from wall to wall. Inside each cage was a person, most appearing dead. Every cage was labeled with the name of a different animal. There was a worm, whose limbs had been severed, its body segmented and forced to wriggle forward using only its head. There were dogs and cats, with long needles replacing their whiskers, their arms and legs amputated below the elbows and knees, forced to crawl on all fours. Other humans, other animals, had elongated or deformed body parts, twisted into grotesque forms of different creatures. They barely looked alive. The inhabitants of the human zoo were ragged, broken, crammed into their tiny enclosures, forced to eat what appeared to be rotting meat, just enough to survive. As I walked past, they looked up at me with mournful, pleading eyes. They wanted freedom, like Thompson. They were shattered, damaged, but they seemed to have accepted that they'd live out their days here. No resistance, no fight. They'd given up. This place was hell. It was hard to think clearly as the stench continued to invade my mind, blurring my vision with dark spots. My heart pounded in my chest, a result of the horrors before me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. This was too much. The man kept walking forward. "This is where I keep the current specimens before deciding to release them into enclosures. And this is where you and all the keepers will work, feeding them, continuing their evolution, and cleaning the cages." My blood boiled. The old man had no regard for the pain he caused, no remorse whatsoever. He was treating humans like animals. This was inhumane, I screamed. The old man looked at me with disappointment. "Look at them. They are animals. All of this is for the ideal. Someday they'll be grateful to know they were the first step in humanity's evolution." He led me to a large pit in the center of the barn, about 10 meters in diameter and 5 meters deep. There was no way in or out. "This is where all keepers begin. You've proven yourself worthy. Your initiation starts now." I felt a hard shove on my back, propelling my body over the edge of the pit. Instinctively, I covered my head with one arm and braced myself to land on my knees, hoping to absorb the fall. I hit the ground with a hard thud. Pain shot through my body, leaving me sprawled on the floor. I lay there, gasping for breath, my chest tight and my knees aching as if they'd shattered. I raised my head to get a better look at where I was. A dusty pit in the middle of the barn where people came to die. Nothing special. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something was circling me as it walked, with stiff steps and exaggerated movements, as if struggling to maintain balance. Each step made a sharp noise that echoed in the pit. Slowly, I stood up, ignoring the pain. I turned to face it, despite the dim lighting. The first thing I noticed was that the creature had no neck. Its head sat directly on its shoulders. The second was that it had no eyelids. It stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, watching my every move. The third was its steel claws, sharp and protruding from its fingertips. And then it spread its wings. It extended its arms, revealing a patchwork of human skin sewn together beneath them. It stared at me for a moment, tilting its head, raising its hands in a menacing gesture, then turned its head completely backward, a full 180 degrees. I was facing a human-owl hybrid. The owl lunged, claws aimed at my chest. I rolled to the side again, feeling the same fear that had consumed me for days. I wasn't fast enough. Its claws tore through my clothes like butter, leaving 3 large gashes across my chest. I ignored the pain and immediately turned back to face it. Letting my guard down would mean death. The owl remained facing the wall. It slowly rotated its head toward me, its wide eyes filled with deep hatred. Panicking, I leapt backward to avoid another attack, but then I realized that if I wanted to survive, I had to act immediately. The longer I hesitated, the weaker I became, and the lower my chances of survival. I lunged at one of its wings, hoping to knock it off balance. It dodged. In that brief moment of error, I forgot that there was still a human inside, just as desperate to survive as I was. I rolled back, springing to my feet. The owl lunged at me again, claws outstretched. My first instinct was to dodge, but I suppressed it. The owl would anticipate that. Instead, I waited until the last moment, then lunged at it as it drew near. I caught it off guard. The owl stumbled, toppling backward, struggling under my weight. I drove my fingers into the seam where its head and shoulders met. It started tearing at the stitches that held them together. The owl thrashed, realizing what I was doing. It dropped to its knees, trying to claw me apart, but its wings got in the way. I kept ripping at the stitches one by one. I could feel the threads loosening. Just a few more minutes, and I'd be free. The owl's movements slowed, as if it realized the fight was over. I pulled the seam apart. Finally, its head came off. I stared at it for a moment, as its eyes stared back at me. Then I flung it into the corner of the pit. Blood seeped from its neck, forming a puddle at my feet. It was over. I looked back toward the barn door. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but no words came out. What the hell was happening on this farm?